It's the final stretch in the race for the White House, but as the campaign draws to a close, many experts predict the issue of race may still play a crucial role on Election Day. So how could race and racism affect the final result? And is America ready to vote in its first black president? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordon. Well, it's a delicate and emotive issue, one that's divided America for decades. The issue of race and racism may yet play a crucial role in deciding who finally gets to the White House. One reminder of how extreme racism can be, federal authorities in Tennessee announced on Monday they'd arrested 2 white men who planned to shoot 88 African Americans and decapitate 14 others, with Barack Obama as their final target. Well, Secret Service agents began protecting Obama in May 2007, shortly after he announced he was running for the Democratic nomination, the earliest that such protection has been authorized for a candidate. Michelle Henry has been finding out if race will be a deciding factor on Election Day.
Oh, say, can you see?
Virginia represents the story of the South. Some of the fiercest battles of the Civil War were fought here. And 100 years later, the Civil Rights Movement struggled to overcome the separate but equal segregation laws that divided blacks and whites. When Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democratic president, signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, he's reported to have said, "We have lost the South for a generation." Virginia is still voting Republican, but Barack Obama is hoping to change this.
And if you will work with me and organize with me, we will not just win Virginia, we will win this general election. And you and I together, we're going to change the country and change the world. God bless you.
It's time for us to have, yes, an African-American president.
Color, it doesn't matter if you're white, pink, purple, blue, green, yellow. If you have the right message and you're willing to help out this country and keep us standing tall, unlike what's happened over the past 8 years, anyone can do it.
Can we trust Barack Obama is a question many Republicans and undecided voters ask. Governor Palin famously said, "This is not a man who sees America the way that you and I see America."
Recent polls suggest that for most, race is not a factor, or at least not one they are prepared to admit to.
If we were not in economically difficult times right now, I think the polls would be different. So it's not a racial factor. It's quite simply that Americans are looking for who is the best potential leader during a very, very difficult time.
But polls are not always reliable. In 1990, Douglas Wilder was running for governor of Virginia. Despite an overwhelming lead before Election Day, he won by just 1/10 of 1%. Race was blamed, but Wilder, now mayor of Richmond, Virginia's capital, argues that it is often the polls themselves that are to blame.
I explain it sometimes with just 2 words: I won. When people have asked me, is America ready for an African American to be president? My question is, why not?
Think back to 1996, Colin Powell seriously considered running for president. And how many Americans were so deeply sad that a black man decided not to run for the presidency back in 1996? And I was telling people back then, you can't say America has not changed.
The Lee brothers, Virginia citizens, American patriots.
That's us.
Republican shock jocks, the Lee brothers at WRVA in Richmond, question whether America has really moved forward. They argue race is still an issue, confusing the election and taking the focus away from real policies.
I think a lot of people say, I'm voting for Barack Obama so people won't think he's a racist. And honestly, neither of us care about color or race. We really don't. If Mickey Mouse were running for president with the right views, we'd vote for him.
Here's a question for the liberal elite. Am I a sexist if I don't vote for Palin? I mean, it's just lunacy to the nth degree. And yeah, sure, there's people are going to try to paint us any way they want, based because we don't want to support an Obama. If they have any brain cells in their head and they've listened to our show, they'll know that our issues with Barack Hussein Obama have nothing to do with his race. Nothing.
More than a century after Lincoln emancipated the slaves, and 44 years after the Civil Rights Act, is the U.S. about to take another pivotal step in its progression towards equality? Michelle Henry, Inside Story, Washington, D.C.
Well, joining us today are our guests in New York. Manning Marable, Professor of African American Studies and Director of the Center for Contemporary Black History at Columbia University. Also in New York, Glenn Ford, co-founder and Executive Director of Black Agenda Report. And in Washington, D.C., Ryan Grimm, a writer for Politico.com. Gentlemen, welcome all to the program. Manning Marable in New York, let me start with you first, if I may. All the polls point to the possibility of America electing its first black American president. What does this say about how America is changing ethnically and racially?
You must keep in mind two things. First, that race has historically been central to the evolution and the content of American politics, even when the tactical public debates do not focus on race. Race is subterranean. It's always lurking there. That's why in this country, Asians born in Asia could, for the most part, could not become U.S. citizens until 1952. That's why in the United States, the majority of African Americans who are citizens of this country, who have been here since 1619, longer than the vast majority of Euro-Americans, could not vote in a presidential election until 1968 due to the Voting Rights Act. So that's the background that people need to keep in mind in thinking about 2008.
Okay, let's put that
The other factor.
Okay, I was going to say, let's just put that point to Glenn Ford, who's also in New York. I mean, if Barack Obama does win the presidency, what does that tell us about race and racism in American life? Is it dead, or is it still very much present in the American political culture, as Manning Marable seems to think?
Well, he will win the presidency only if if his appeals to white voters are successful, and he's made those appeals consistently. Made appeals to Reagan Democrats by beginning in Nevada earlier this year, praising Ronald Reagan, identifying with Ronald Reagan's differences with the so-called excesses of the 60s. So Barack Obama has made his case, but there is a consensus out there in corporate media to pre-election absolve white America of any racism, and that seems to be a joint venture abroad in journalism land.
Let's just bring in Ryan Grimm there in Washington, D.C. Ryan, do you think Barack Obama's campaign perhaps has forced the black community to re-examine and reevaluate white America? I mean, is racial reconciliation possible now more than ever?
Well, it depends on what happens for the next week, for one. Going back to the point that was just made, one thing that's interesting about Obama's campaign is that he has, quote, transcended race. And that tells you a lot about the role that race still does play in the election, because if you have to transcend your race, then it says something about the relationship. A white candidate isn't normally asked to transcend his race. It's something that's asked of a black candidate. However, all that being said, if you look, most polls of African American voters back in October, November, December, before Obama won Iowa, black voters insisted that that Obama didn't have a chance. Once they saw in Iowa that he did have a chance, and we're talking about Iowa here, this is about as white a state as they come. When black voters saw Iowa go for Obama, then they had to say, well, yeah, what else is this country capable of? Is something possible? And as Obama racked up win after win in places like Idaho throughout February, there was something really shaking in this country. Since then, it's become a little bit more tense, but it did open a window into some possible reconciliation, I think.
It's an interesting point you make about this issue of transcending race. Let's bring in back Manning Marable in New York, because many of the experts say that Obama is one of a new generation of African Americans. How far removed is he from the black agenda of the early 70s, and how successful has he been in transcending race?
I think that that's the most important story that has not gotten the kind of play in the national media over the last year. Really what Obama represents is the rising of a new generation of African American leadership. We could call them a kind of post-black leadership who do not anchor their politics to a race base, or framing their politics to explicitly black constituencies or black issues. Back in the 1970s and 80s, with the rise of the Congressional Black Caucus and thousands of black elected officials all over the United States, there was great energy around what was frequently called a black agenda. How could African Americans, who had long been shut out of the mainstream of American political and economic life, put forward their own demands? And black elected officials were seen as representatives of constituencies that had been historically marginalized. Now, a generation goes by, and by the time we reach 2000, a significant percentage of white Americans who had no relationship to the civil rights era, who did not grow up under the normative values of racial segregation, they will now vote for an African American without regard to her or his color. And conversely, a number of older Americans who were raised under Jim Crow segregation no longer exist. And so consequently, a black elite emerges. People like Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, or Deval Patrick of Massachusetts, that Barack Obama represents that generation that do not make overt racial appeals, but who frame a politics that is race neutral.
Okay, I want to just bring in Glenn Ford before we go to a break. Glenn Ford, many pundits say that race has been the hardest thing for Americans to talk about now that a black man is a serious contender for the presidency. Why is that so? I mean, why hasn't race been a more prominent issue on this campaign trail?
Well, because of the great victories of the 60s and early 70s, being racist, speaking overtly racist, is just not polite in American society. But not vocalizing overt racism does not mean that racism is gone. And it certainly does not mean that that Obama has transcended race when he is compelled, and that's very clear, compelled to pander to racists in order to have a chance at victory. Clearly, race is front and center in this campaign. And in fact, with a financial meltdown well underway and the war still going on that the vast majority of people want to get away from, the fact that John McCain even has a glimmer of a chance of winning the presidency shows that being black is a lot of baggage to carry in the United States.
All right, gentlemen, stay with us, won't you? Because it's time for a short break now. But when we come back, we take a closer look at how race has played on the media agenda. More on that. Stay with us.